My mother-in-law stood up at the dinner table, tapped her glass with a spoon, and told 20 people the name of my unborn son. A name I had never agreed to. A name I had told her to her face that I did not want. And my husband just smiled. He smiled like it was the proudest moment of his life. Like his mother had handed us a gift, instead of taking the last thing I had left to give my own child. I was 7 months pregnant. I was sitting at the end of a long table in a house I never picked, wearing a dress I bought because she said the other one washed me out, having driven there in a car she chose for me. My own mother's photo was in my purse, 2 feet from my hand, and this woman was about to erase her without even knowing it. And in that 1 second, with everyone clapping, something inside me that had been bending for 3 years finally broke. I didn't yell. I want you to know that. People think these stories end with screaming. Mine didn't. I just put my fork down very quietly. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to say something, anything. He didn't. So I said one word. And the whole room went silent. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand why one word from a pregnant woman could make a grown man's mother go white in the face, you have to understand how I got there. How I let it happen. How a woman who used to have an opinion about everything slowly became someone who asked permission to exist in her own marriage. It didn't start with the baby. It didn't even start with the house or the car. It started so small that I didn't see it coming. That's the part that still keeps me awake at night. Not that she took over my life. That I handed it to her, one polite little surrender at a time, and told myself I was keeping the peace. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old. And this is the story of how I let another woman choose my house, my car, and almost the name of my son. And what it finally cost me to say the one word I should have said on the very first day. So let me take you back to the beginning. Back to before I knew what I was walking into. I met Mark at a wedding. Not mine, obviously. A coworker's. I was 29, I was tired of dating men who texted back 3 days later. And I almost didn't go. He was the one fixing the bride's father's tie in the parking lot. That's the first thing I ever saw him do. Some old man fumbling with a bow tie, frustrated, about to give up. And this tall stranger just stepped in, calm, patient, tied it for him and patted him on the shoulder like it was nothing. I remember thinking, there's a man who takes care of people. I held on to that thought for a long time. Years. Because that was true. Mark did take care of people. I just didn't understand yet that there was a line for whose needs came first, and I was nowhere near the front of it. We talked the whole reception. He was easy to talk to in a way that felt rare. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered things I said an hour later and brought them back up. When I told him my mom had passed when I was 19, he didn't do the thing people do, that quick sorry and change the subject. He just got quiet and he said, that explains why you carry yourself like you've already survived the worst thing. I'd never had anyone see me like that. I think I half fell in love right there at table 9. The first time he mentioned his mother, it was sweet. We were 3 dates in, sitting in his car outside my apartment, and his phone buzzed. He looked at it and smiled this soft smile and said, my mom. She likes to know I got somewhere safe. He texted her back, just a quick home soon, and put the phone away. I thought it was lovely. A grown man who still checked in with his mother. After losing mine, that kind of closeness looked like a miracle to me. It looked like family. What I didn't count was how often that phone buzzed. First it was funny. We'd be at dinner and Diane would call, and Mark would step away and come back and I'd tease him, mama's boy, and he'd laugh. By the 4th month I noticed I'd stopped teasing because it had stopped being a joke. She called every day. Sometimes twice. Not emergencies. Just to talk. Just to ask what we were doing, where we were going, what we were eating. And every time Mark answered. Every single time. I met Diane for the first time at a Sunday lunch at her house. I spent 2 days picking out what to wear. I brought flowers. I was nervous in the way you only get when you already know somewhere deep that this person matters more than they should. She was lovely. I want to be fair about that because the story is easier if she's a monster, and she wasn't. She was warm and funny and she'd cooked for half the day. She hugged me at the door and said, so you're the one keeping my Mark so busy, and laughed and I laughed and it all felt fine. It was the small things at that lunch. Things I filed away and didn't look at again until much later. The way she served Mark's plate before anyone else, including herself, and knew without asking that he didn't want the crust on his bread. The way she said when I mentioned I was a graphic designer, "Oh, that's nice, you can always do that from home once there are babies." We had been dating 4 months. I laughed it off. The way when I went to use the bathroom, I overheard her in the kitchen saying to Mark, "Lo, she seems sweet, but does she know how you like things?" Like I was a new appliance that might not be compatible. On the drive home, I almost said something. I had it on my tongue. "Your mom's a lot, isn't she?" But Mark was so happy. He was glowing. He said, "She really liked you. I can tell she doesn't warm up to people fast." And I looked at how much it meant to him and I swallowed it. I told myself I was being unfair. New girlfriend, protective mother, totally normal. Give it time. That was the first surrender. The very first one. So small I didn't even feel it go. There were others that year, if I'm honest with myself now. The weekend trip I planned for our anniversary that turned into a family trip because Diane mentioned she'd never been to the coast and Mark couldn't stand the thought of her hearing about it after. The apartment I wanted us to move into together that Mark suddenly went cold on. And only months later did I learn his mother had driven by it and decided the neighborhood was wrong for us. At the time he just said it didn't feel right. He was good at that. Letting her decision come out of his mouth like it was his own. I want you to understand I wasn't stupid. I wasn't some doormat who didn't know her own mind. I ran a department. I made decisions all day that other adults followed. I just had this blind spot. This one room in the house of my life where I'd handed someone else the keys and kept telling myself I'd take them back later. Later. When the moment was right. When it mattered more. The trouble with later is it never announces itself. Just keeps not arriving. Here's the thing nobody tells you about losing yourself in a marriage. It is never one big moment where you hand over your whole life. If it were, you'd notice. You'd fight. It's 1,000 tiny moments where saying nothing is just easier than the fight. And each time you say nothing, the next time gets easier too. Until one day you look up and you don't recognize a single decision around you as your own. But I'm jumping ahead again. Because at that point I was still happy. Genuinely. Mark proposed 8 months later on a Tuesday, no big production, just the two of us on the couch, and he cried when he asked and I said yes before he finished the sentence. I had no idea that the next argument we'd have, the first real one, wouldn't be about money or the future or anything couples are supposed to fight about. It would be about a house. A house I'd already fallen in love with. A house we were never going to buy. The house I fell in love with was small. I'll start there because I think it matters. It was a little blue Craftsman on a street with old trees, the kind where the roots push up the sidewalk and nobody fixes it because everybody likes it that way. 2 bedrooms. A porch that needed paint. A kitchen window that looked out over a yard just big enough for a garden and someday a swing set. It was not impressive. It was not the kind of house you brag about. But I stood in that kitchen and I could see our whole life in it. And I'm not a woman who imagines things easily. My chest actually ached. That's how I knew. Mark felt it too. I watched him in that house. He held my hand on the porch and said, "Yeah, I could see us here." We made an offer that night. It was under asking. We could afford it without stretching. The agent said the sellers were motivated. For about 36 hours it was ours in every way except the paperwork, and I was the happiest I'd ever been. Then we made the mistake of telling Diane. I say we. It was Mark, of course. He couldn't keep good news from his mother for a single day. He called her that night, and I heard his side of it from the next room, and I heard the exact moment his voice changed. It went from excited to defensive to that flat, careful tone he used when he was being talked out of something and trying to pretend he wasn't. She came to see it the next morning. We hadn't even asked her to. She walked through every room with her arms crossed, and she didn't say one cruel thing, not one, and somehow by the time she left, the house was ruined. The kitchen was too small for a family. The second bedroom got no morning light, bad for a baby. The street she'd heard had flooded once years ago. Did we really want to risk it? The schools, she wasn't sure about the schools. The commute would add 20 minutes to Mark's drive, and didn't I care about his time? Everything she said came wrapped in worry, in love, in just looking out for you both. And every single point landed on Mark like gospel. By that afternoon he wasn't sure anymore. By that evening he wanted to pull the offer. We had our first real fight, the first one with a raised voice, in the car outside that little blue house, and I remember saying, "This is our decision, Mark, ours," and I remember the look on his face. Not angry. Worse. Confused. Like I'd said something that didn't compute. Like the idea that a decision could be just ours without her was a language he didn't speak. We pulled the offer. He told me it was practical. He told me his mother had a point about resale. He told me we'd find something better. And the worst part, the part I'm ashamed of, is that I let him talk me into it being a relief. I actually thanked him later for being so level-headed. I rewrote it in my own head so it wouldn't hurt. That's a skill you learn when you're losing. You get very good at calling the loss something else. 3 weeks later, Diane found us a house. She didn't suggest it. She found it. A bigger house in her neighborhood 4 streets from her own front door. 5 bedrooms we didn't need. A formal dining room. A price that made my stomach drop and a mortgage that meant I could not, in fact, ever do my work from home and raise babies, because we would both need to work full-time until we were old. She walked us through it like a queen showing off a wing of her palace, and she kept saying, "Now this is a house you can grow into. This is a forever house," and Mark was nodding, and I was standing in a foyer the size of my mother's old living room feeling something cold settle into me. I tried. I wanted on the record that I tried. I said, "It's beautiful, but it's so much more than we talked about, and it's so close to your mom's. Are we sure we want to be that close?" And Diane turned to me with the kindest smile and said, "Oh honey, you'll be grateful to have me 4 minutes away when that baby comes and you haven't slept in 3 days." And Mark put his arm around me and said, "She's right, you'll see." And just like that, the two of them had decided, and I was the one being unreasonable for wanting a smaller, cheaper, freer life. We bought that house. I signed the papers. My signature is right there next to his on a 30-year commitment to a building I never wanted, on a street I never picked, chosen by a woman who was not on the loan and would never make a single payment, but would absolutely have a key. That part one learned later too. She had a key. He gave it to her before I even knew it existed. I found out the first time she let herself in while I was in the shower, and I came downstairs in a towel to find my mother-in-law in my kitchen, putting away groceries she'd bought us, rearranging my cabinets to how she thought they should be. I screamed, just from the shock of someone being there. And she laughed and said, "Oh, did I scare you? I have a key. Didn't Mark tell you? Didn't Mark tell you?" That became a whole phrase in my marriage. Didn't Mark tell you? He never did. He just let me find out, again and again, that decisions had already been made in rooms I wasn't in. I told my sister Nina about the key. She went very quiet on the phone the way she does, and then she said something I didn't want to hear. She said, "Claire, you didn't marry a man with a close family. You married a family with a man attached." And I got angry at her. I defended him. I hung up on my own sister to protect a marriage that was slowly erasing me, because the car was next. And by then I'd gotten so used to losing that I almost didn't fight at all. My car died the spring after we moved in. 11 years old, it finally gave out on the highway, and honestly I was a little relieved. I'd been wanting something newer, and for once this was a decision that was clearly mine. My money mostly from my own savings. My car. My choice. I had it picked out. A small hybrid, good on gas, easy to park, the kind of practical I actually like. I'd done the research. I'd test-driven it. I'd already started imagining myself in it. I made the mistake again, the same mistake I apparently could not stop making, of mentioning it at Sunday lunch. Diane put down her fork. I can still see it. She put down her fork and she said, "A hybrid? Oh, Claire, no. Those aren't safe in a crash. Everybody knows that, all that battery. You're going to be carrying my grandchild around in that." And there it was. We weren't even pregnant yet. There was no grandchild. But she'd already placed an imaginary baby in the back seat of my decision, and made me the woman willing to risk it. Mark agreed with her before he'd heard a single fact. He didn't ask what I'd researched. He didn't ask why I wanted it. He just said, "Mom's right, safety first, let's look at something bigger. Let's look." Like it was a we. Like my savings were a we. Like my car was a family asset and I was 1 vote out of 3, and somehow always the losing vote. You know what I drive now? I told you at the very beginning. A car Diane chose. A big heavy SUV, the kind she approved of, in a color she liked that I never picked and never wanted and pay for every month. The first time I drove it I cried at a red light. Not because it's a bad car. It's a fine car. I cried because I realized I could not point to one major thing in my life anymore that I had chosen for myself. The house. The car. The neighborhood. The cabinets, even the cabinets were hers. I was 32 years old and living inside another woman's preferences, wearing them like a coat that didn't fit, and calling it my life. I started getting quiet around that time. Nina noticed before I did. She said I'd gotten smaller. Not in body. In voice. She said when we were kids I argued with everyone about everything and now I just went along and she missed me. I told her she was imagining it. But I knew. At dinner parties I'd catch myself looking at Mark before I answered simple questions, checking his face to see if my opinion was allowed. Do we like that restaurant? Are we free that weekend? I'd outsourced my own preferences to a man who'd outsourced his to his mother. The whole thing ran downhill and I was at the bottom. There was a birthday that year, Mark's birthday, that I think about more than I should. I'd spent weeks on a gift. A watch, his grandfather's old watch that I'd tracked down and had restored. The one his dad used to wear. The one he'd mentioned once with this faraway look. It cost me a fortune and 3 months of phone calls. I was so proud. And at his party, before he even opened mine, Diane handed him a box. And inside was a brand new watch, expensive, flashy, and she said every man should have a real watch from his mother. He put it on right there. He wore it the rest of the night. My gift sat in its little box on the table, opened later in private, with a quiet thank you. He still has both. He wears hers. I have never said a word about it. That's who I'd become. A woman who could give a man his dead father's watch, and lose to a department store box because she'd already learned not to compete. The strange part, the part that kept me stuck, is that Mark loved me. I never doubted that. That's what made it so hard. If he'd been cruel, I'd have left. Cruel is easy to leave. But he'd bring me coffee in bed. He'd rub my feet when I was tired. He'd look at me across a room sometimes with so much tenderness it took my breath. He was not a bad man. He was a loyal man who had pledged his loyalty to the wrong person first, and there was simply no room left over for me to come first at anything that mattered. I got the tenderness. Diane got the decisions. And I kept accepting the trade because the tenderness was real, and I was lonely enough to live on it. I brought it up once. Calmly. We were in bed, lights off, which is when I was bravest, when I didn't have to see his face. I said, Mark, I feel like your mom makes a lot of our choices. And he was quiet for a while, and then he said something that I think about all the time. He said, she gave up everything for me after my dad died. I'm all she has. I can't be the son who pushes her away. And then he said, you understand, you lost your mom. You'd give anything for one more day of her telling you what to do. And that was the knife, because it was almost true. It used my grief against my freedom. It made my wanting a voice in my own life sound like I didn't appreciate having a mother at all. I went silent. I let him think he'd said something wise. I lay there in the dark in a house I didn't choose, and I grieved my mother and my marriage at the same time, and they felt like the same loss. I should have left then. I know that now. But I'll tell you what I did instead, because it's the most human and most foolish thing, and maybe you've done it too. I decided a baby would fix it. I told myself that once there was a child, a real one, not Diane's imaginary one, Mark would finally have someone he put first that was ours. That he'd become a father and find a spine. That the baby would be the thing that was mine, truly mine, that no one could rearrange like kitchen cabinets. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. Because the baby didn't give me something to hold on to. The baby gave Diane her greatest project yet. And the day I told her I was pregnant, before I'd even told my own sister, she was already planning a life for my child that I was not invited to design. Starting with his name. I want to tell you about the name first before I tell you what Diane did with it, because you need to understand what it actually meant. My mother's name was not Henry, obviously. My mother's name was Joan. But when I was little, maybe 7, 8, she used to talk about the family she came from, and there was a name she said with this particular softness. Henry. Her own father, the grandfather I never met, who died before I was born. She said he was the gentlest man who ever lived. She said when she was small and scared of storms, he'd sit on the floor of her room and tell her the thunder was just God moving furniture. She told me once, and I never forgot it, she said, if I ever have a grandson, his name is going to be Henry, and he's going to be gentle like my dad, I can feel it. She never got the grandson. She died when I was 19. Cancer, the fast kind, for months from the word to the funeral. And in those 4 months, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and the flowers people kept bringing, she held my hand one night and she was tired and a little far away on the medication, and she said, you'll give me a Henry someday, won't you? And I said, yes, Mama. Promised her. It was one of the last clear things she ever asked me for. So when I found out I was having a boy, I didn't have to think. There was no list. There was no debate. His name was Henry. It had been his name for 15 years, since a hospital room, since a promise. That name was the one thing I was bringing into this marriage that was entirely, unshakably mine. My mother's love, handed forward to a little boy she'd never get to hold. It was the most precious thing I owned. You can probably already feel where this is going. That's the cruelty of it. I could feel it too, and I still didn't see how bad it would get. The pregnancy itself, Diane took over within a week. I'm not exaggerating for the story. Within a week, she came to my second appointment without being invited, because Mark mentioned the date and she just showed up in the waiting room. She started buying things. A crib before I'd looked at cribs. A car seat. Tiny clothes and colors she liked. She booked the painter for the nursery and chose the color, a pale institutional green she called calming, and when I said I'd imagine something warmer, she said the green was better for a baby's developing eyes, she'd read a study, and Mark said let's just go with what Mom found. She had opinions about my body, what I should eat, how much I should walk. She'd called to ask if I'd taken my vitamins, like I was a child she was raising instead of a grown woman growing a child of my own. She told people, her friends, the neighbors were pregnant, in this way that made my skin crawl. As though the three of us were in it together and I was just the one carrying. And through all of it I kept quiet because I was tired and hormonal and scared, and because 8 months pregnant is the worst possible time to start a war you've spent 3 years avoiding. I told myself the name was safe. The name was the one thing I was sure of. I'd said it out loud to both of them early, almost as soon as we knew it was a boy. I said, his name is Henry, it's after my grandfather, it's something I promised my mom. I thought saying my mom would end it. I thought even Diane wouldn't step on that. I was so naive. Looking back, I want to shake that woman, that earlier me, sitting there feeling safe. Because here's what Diane did. She didn't argue with me about the name. That's not how she worked. She never argued, not directly, not where you could catch her. She just started, slowly like water finding a crack, to act as though the name was still open. She'd say at dinner, well, when we figure out his name. She'd say, I've always loved the name Charles, that was Mark's father. You know, the firstborn son should carry the father's name, it's tradition in this family. She said it to me gently like a suggestion, and I said, his name is Henry, Diane, and she smiled and said, of course dear, we'll see. We'll see. The same word she used about the house. We'll see was how Diane said no to you while letting you think the conversation was still going. I went to Mark. Of course I went to Mark. I said, your mom keeps bringing up Charles, you need to tell her his name is Henry, you know what it means to me. And Mark, my husband, the father of this child, looked uncomfortable, and he said the thing that I think finally started to wake me up. He said, would it be so bad? Charles. It would mean a lot to her, and Henry could be the middle name. The middle name. He wanted to make my dying mother's promise the middle name so his living mother could have the front of my son. I called Nina that night, sitting on the bathroom floor so Mark wouldn't hear. And I told her everything, and she didn't say I told you so, which is the kindest thing she's ever done. She just listened to me cry. And then she asked me one question that I couldn't answer. She said, Claire, if your mom could see you right now, about to hand away the one thing she asked you for, what would she say? And I sat on that cold tile with no answer, because I already knew, and the answer was unbearable. My mother would not recognize the woman I'd let myself become. The girl who argued with everyone was gone. I traded her away one polite surrender at a time, and now I was about to trade away my mother's last wish too, just to keep the peace at a dinner table. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, and for the first time in 3 years I didn't grieve quietly. I got angry. A small, hard, clean anger way down where I'd been burying everything. And somewhere in the dark I understood that this was the line. Not the house. Not the car. This. They could have the cabinets. They could have the green nursery. They were not getting Henry. I just didn't know yet that Diane had already decided to take him anyway, in front of everyone, where she thought I'd never dare to fight back. The thing about deciding to fight is that the other person can feel it before you've done anything at all. I hadn't said a word. I'd made up my mind in the dark that night, that the name was the line, but I'd kept it inside me like a held breath. And yet within days Diane started moving faster, the way a storm picks up right before it lands. I think on some animal level she knew her time was running out, that the soft, slow taking that had worked for 3 years had finally hit something it couldn't dissolve. So she stopped being slow. There was a lunch, a small one, just family, the week after I drew that line in my own head. Diane had something for me, she said. She'd been so excited all morning. She brought out a box wrapped in silver paper, and inside, folded in tissue, was a baby blanket. Hand embroidered. Beautiful, honestly, she'd paid someone real money for it. And stitched into the corner in careful blue thread was a single letter. C. She watched my face while I lifted it out. Everyone was cooing. My father-in-law's sister said, "Oh, how precious is that for the name?" And Diane said, "Well, we're still finalizing, but I had a feeling." And she looked right at me. I had a feeling. I held that blanket in my hands and I felt the old reflex come up, the swallow, the smile, the keeping of the peace. And I felt myself for once refuse it. I didn't make a scene. But I folded the blanket back into the box and I set it aside and I said in a voice that came out steadier than I expected, "It's lovely work, Diane. His name is Henry." And the table went a little quiet, and she laughed and waved her hand and said, "Oh, we'll see," and changed the subject. But I'd said it in front of people. Small. But I'd said it. That night I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I bought something for my own son by myself without asking, without checking anyone's face. A little white onesie. And I had it made by the same kind of person Diane used, with one letter on the chest. H. I hung it in the green nursery I hadn't chosen on the wall where I could see it. My little flag planted in occupied territory. Mark saw it and didn't say anything, but I caught him looking at it and I couldn't read his face and I didn't ask. 2 days later it was gone. Not thrown away. Moved. I found it folded in a drawer underneath things, the way you put away something you've decided doesn't belong. I asked Mark. He got that look. He said his mother had been over to drop off groceries and maybe she'd tidied. She'd come into my house with her key, gone into my baby's room, and taken down the one thing in it I had chosen, and folded it away in the dark like a secret. Called Mark at work. I didn't yell. I was past yelling. I said, "Your mother took the onesie down." And he sighed, the sigh of a man who just wants the problem to be smaller than it is, and he said, "Claire, she's just excited. Can't you let her be excited? She doesn't mean anything by it. Let her be excited." As though my son's name were a party favor I was being stingy with. As though her excitement were more fragile, more deserving of protection, than my mother's last wish. I hung up. And I sat in that nursery and I took the H onesie out of the drawer and I hung it back on the wall. My father called that same evening out of nowhere, the way he sometimes did. He's not a man of many words, my dad. He raised Nina and me alone after Mom passed and he showed love mostly by fixing things and showing up. He asked how I was and I lied and said fine and there was a pause and then he said, "Your mother would have liked to see you with that baby." And I almost broke right there. Because he didn't know. He had no idea about the blanket, the onesie, the name, any of it. He was just missing her out loud the way he did sometimes. And it hit me that I was about to let his wife's last wish, the Henry she asked me for, get folded into a drawer in the dark, and he would never even know it had happened. That I'd have lied about that too, the way I lied about everything now to keep the peace. I understood something that night that I should have understood years before. This was never going to be settled in private. Privately, it was always 2 against 1. Privately, she'd just keep tidying, keep correcting, keep having feelings, until I was worn down to nothing and there was a Charles on the birth certificate and everyone would say I'd come around. The only way to end it was in the open, where she couldn't pivot to wounded in a quiet kitchen, where there'd be witnesses to what was actually happening. I didn't have to wait long for the open because Diane handed it to me herself. She called a few days later, bright as anything, to announce she was throwing a dinner. A big one. Both families. To celebrate the baby before he came. Her treat, her house, I wasn't to lift a finger. And while she talked, going on about the menu and the guest list and the decorations she had planned, I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not dread. Something colder and clearer than dread. I felt almost grateful. Because she was building me a stage. 20 chairs. An audience. The exact room I needed. I told Nina that night. I said, "She's having a dinner, everyone's going to be there." And Nina, who'd watched me shrink for years, who'd been telling me to wake up the whole time, went quiet on the phone. And then she said, "Are you finally going to say something?" And I looked at the H onesie on the nursery wall, my little flag still hanging there because I put it back. And I said the first brave thing I'd said out loud to anyone in 3 years. I said, "Yes. Think I am." I just didn't know yet exactly how, Or that when the moment came it would only take one word. The next 2 weeks were the quietest war you've ever seen. Nobody shouted. From the outside our house looked exactly the same. But underneath something had shifted in me, and I think Diane could smell it the way she sensed everything because she got busier. Sweeter and busier at the same time, which with her was always the warning sign. She started doing this thing where she'd refer to the baby as Charlie. Casually. In passing. Oh, did Charlie kick today? I bought a little outfit for Charlie. She'd say it and watch my face for half a second and then move on, and if I corrected her, his name is Henry, she'd touch her chest and say, oh, of course, force of habit, I just have such a feeling he's a Charles. A feeling. As though my son's identity were something she could intuit better than I could choose. I stopped correcting her out loud after a while, not because I gave in but because I decided something. I decided to stop fighting the small battles I always lost and save everything for one I wouldn't. I was done arguing in kitchens and hallways where it was always 2 against 1 and I always folded. Let her say Charlie. Let her buy the outfits. The name on the birth certificate would be mine to write, and I was the one who'd be in that hospital room, and I was the mother. And somewhere in those 2 weeks I remembered that being a mother might actually mean something other than being outvoted. But I made one mistake. I should have forced it into the open before the dinner. I should have made Mark sit down with his mother and say the words clearly. His name is Henry, end of discussion. I didn't because confrontation still terrified me, and because I kept hoping Mark would do it on his own. I kept giving him chances to be the man who fixed his tie for a stranger in a parking lot. I kept waiting for that man to defend his wife. He never did. I'd ask him, did you talk to your mom? And he'd say, the time wasn't right, she was stressed about her knee, the moment will come. He was a master of the moment that never came. And the longer he stalled, the more I understood that he wasn't going to choose. He was hoping the problem would resolve itself, which in his family always meant resolving in his mother's favor while he kept his hands clean. So the dinner sat out there on the calendar, getting closer, and Diane planned it for weeks. Both sides of the family. A gender reveal, sort of, except everyone already knew it was a boy, so really it was just Diane wanting an audience. 20 people. Her house. Her table. She told me not to lift a finger, just rest, let me handle everything, and I should have heard the trap in it. When Diane handled everything, everything went her way. Nina called me the morning of. She could hear something in my voice. She said, you don't have to go, you know. And I said, I have to go, she'd never forgive me. And Nina said the thing that I carried into that house like a stone in my pocket. She said, Claire, you keep going along to keep a peace that was never real. There is no peace. There's just you disappearing. At some point you have to decide if Henry is going to be raised by his mother or by his grandmother, because right now he doesn't have a mother. He has a woman who lost herself, and that little boy is going to need more than that. That little boy is going to need more than that. I got dressed in a dress Diane had picked, in a house Diane had chosen, and I drove to her dinner in a car Diane had bought me, and the whole way there I had Nina's words running under everything like a second heartbeat. I want to tell you I'd made a plan. I hadn't. I had no idea what I was going to do. I only knew the one line, the place where the surrendering had to stop, and I knew we were driving straight toward it. I had my mother's photo in my purse. I don't know why I brought it. I'd been doing that lately, carrying her with me. I think part of me wanted her there in the room. I think part of me knew I was going to need her. In the car 10 minutes out I tried one last time. I said it plainly, no anger, just tired. I said, Mark, if your mother says one word tonight about naming him Charles, I need you to back me. In front of everyone if you have to. Can you do that for me? And he kept his eyes on the road and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, let's just not make a scene tonight, okay? It's a party, everyone's happy, we can sort the name thing out later. We can sort it out later. There it was again. Later. The country where my voice went to die. I looked out the window and I didn't answer him, and he took my silence for agreement the way he always had, and he reached over and squeezed my knee and said, thank you, like I just promised to disappear one more time. The house was full when we got there. Mark's aunts, his cousins, a couple of neighbors, my father who'd driven 2 hours, Nina who'd insisted on coming when she heard the tone of my voice. Diane was radiant, moving through her guests like a host at a gala, and the table was set beautifully, and there were little blue decorations everywhere, and a banner, and at the center of the table where I should have known to look, there was a cake. A big white cake. And I didn't get close enough to read it at first. I was being hugged and congratulated and steered around the room. It wasn't until we all sat down, until Diane stood up and tapped her glass with that spoon, until 20 faces turned toward her with their loving expectant smiles, that I finally saw what was written across the top of that cake in pale blue icing. Said, "Welcome, baby Charles." And Diane lifted her glass, and she opened her mouth to make it official in front of every person we knew. "And that is the moment you found me in, at the very beginning. So now you know everything that led there. Let me tell you what I did." Diane tapped her glass and the room quieted, 20 people turning toward her, and she stood there glowing in the candlelight with her wine raised. She said, "I just want to thank you all for coming to celebrate this beautiful blessing." And she put her free hand on her chest and got a little teary, and people made the warm sounds people make. And then she said, "And I think the time has come to share his name." She looked around the table, savoring it, the queen with her court. She said, "In this family, the firstborn son carries his grandfather's name. And it would have meant the world to Mark's father, God rest him. So everyone please raise a glass. To little Charles. To little Charles." And 20 glasses started to lift. I watched them rise. My father confused looking at me. My aunts. The neighbors. Nina frozen, her glass on the table, her eyes locked on mine. And Mark. Mark lifted his glass. My husband lifted his glass to a name that was not his son's name, with his wife sitting right next to him, and he smiled that proud smile, and that was the thing. That smile. 3 years of swallowing it, and the smile is what broke me. I put my fork down. I did it quietly. I remember the small click of it against the plate, how loud it sounded to me. And the glasses were up and Diane was beaming, and I looked at my husband one more time, one last time, giving him the half second he'd had 1,000 times to choose me, and he didn't, he just held his glass higher, and so I said it. I said one word. I said no. That's it. That's the word. Not a speech. Just no. But I said it into the exact pocket of silence before everyone drank, and it landed like a glass dropped on a tile floor. Every head turned. The raised glasses stopped in the air. Diane's smile froze on her face, that perfect hostess smile, with no expression left underneath it. And the room went so quiet I could hear the candles. Diane recovered first. She gave a little laugh, the kind that tells everyone the awkward thing is over, and she said, "Oh, Claire, sweetheart, what do you mean no?" And she went to lift her glass again. And I stood up. 7 months pregnant, I stood up at that table, and my legs were shaking, but my voice, for the first time in 3 years, was not. I said, "His name is Henry." I said it to the whole table, to all 20 of them, so there could be no later, no sorting it out, no "we'll see." I said, "His name is Henry, after my grandfather. It is a name I promised my mother before she died in a hospital room when I was 19 years old. It is the last thing she ever asked me for. And I have let this family choose my house and my car and the color of the walls my son will sleep behind, and I let it, that's on me, I let it. But I am not letting you choose his name. His name is not yours to give. It was never yours to give." Nobody moved. Diane's mouth opened and nothing came out. And I wasn't finished because 3 years was coming up out of me now and there was no stopping it. I turned to Mark. I said his name, just his name, Mark, and he looked at me like a man watching his house catch fire. And I said, "I have waited our entire marriage for you to stand up for me one time. One time. And every time, every single time you have chosen her. You chose her over our first house. You chose her over my car. And just now you raised your glass to a name you knew would break my heart, while I sat right next to you carrying your child. So I need you to understand that I am done waiting. I am not asking you to choose me over your mother anymore. I'm telling you that you already chose, you've been choosing for years, and I finally heard you." The silence after that was the loudest thing I've ever stood inside. And then my father, my quiet father who hadn't said 2 words all night, pushed back his chair and stood up next to me. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just put his hand on my shoulder and looked at Diane and said, "Joan asked her for that, Henry." I was there. And then he looked at Mark and he said, "Son, when are you going to grow up?" And Nina stood too. And the 3 of us just stood there, on my side of a table that had never had a single person on my side before. Diane finally found her voice, and it had gone cold, all the sugar burned off. She said, "I have done nothing but love this family and try to help. And this is how I am spoken to in my own home." And there it was, the move I'd watched 100 times, the pivot to wounded. The way she made every line she crossed into someone else's cruelty for noticing. But this time it didn't work. Because for the first time she'd done it in front of everyone and everyone had just watched the whole thing and you could feel it in the room, that quiet recalibration when a group of people all realize at the same moment what they're actually looking at. Picked up my purse. My mother's photo was inside it. I held it without taking it out, just held the shape of it through the leather. And I looked at Mark one more time and I said, "I'm going home." And then I heard myself say something I hadn't planned, something that surprised even me as it came out. I said, "To my home. The little blue one. I'm calling the agent on Monday." And I walked out of that dinner, past the cake that said "Welcome baby Charles" into the night, not knowing if my marriage was walking out with me or staying at that table. Mark didn't follow me out that night. I want to be honest about that because the movie version is that he ran after me into the rain. He didn't. I drove home alone to the big house I never picked, and I sat on the floor of the green nursery in the dark, and I waited and he didn't come home for 3 hours. When he finally did, I was still on that floor. He sat down next to me against the wall, not touching me, and for a long time neither of us said anything. And then he said the truest thing he'd ever said to me. He said, "I didn't know it was that bad." And I said, "I know you didn't." Because that was the whole tragedy of it. He genuinely hadn't known. He'd spent so long keeping his eyes closed to keep the peace that he'd never once looked directly at what it was costing me. He told me he'd stayed behind to talk to his mother. That she'd cried, that she'd done the wounded thing. The "how could you let your wife speak to me that way" thing. And he said, for the first time in my life I didn't comfort her. I just let her be upset. And he said it like a man describing the hardest thing he'd ever done. And the awful part is for him it was. I'm going to step out of the story for just a second because if you've stayed with me this long all the way to that nursery floor, then you know exactly what this kind of thing feels like, the slow erasing, the keeping of a peace that costs you everything. This channel is full of these stories, the real ones, the ones people actually live. And if they mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let me tell you what happened because the night on the floor was not the end. It was barely the beginning. We did not fix it that night. I want to be careful not to lie to you and tie a bow on it. We almost didn't fix it at all. Choosing me did not come naturally to Mark. It was not one grand decision. It was 100 small ones, the exact opposite of how he'd lost me, 100 small choices to put me first, and he got a lot of them wrong before he got them right. We started seeing someone. A counselor. A quiet woman named Patrice who didn't take sides, and somehow that made Mark hear things he'd never heard from me. He learned slowly in that office what the word enmeshment meant, and I watched it land on him like a diagnosis he'd been carrying his whole life without a name. He cried in there more than once. I'd never seen him cry except the day he proposed. He had a lot stored up too. That's the thing I had to learn. He wasn't a villain who chose his mother. He was a son who'd been raised to believe that loving her meant having no self, and it nearly cost him a family of his own before he understood the difference. Diane did not change overnight. She is who she is. But the locks changed, literally we changed the locks, and her key did not work anymore. And the first time she had to knock on her own son's door and wait to be let in, something in the arrangement shifted for good. She had to be invited now. She hated it. She tested it constantly. But the door was ours. We sold the big house. I called the agent that Monday like I said I would, standing in the kitchen with my coffee, my voice steady. We didn't get the little blue Craftsman back, it was long gone, somebody else's life by then. But we found another small one on another street with old trees. And the kitchen window looks out over a yard just big enough for a garden and someday a swing set. Picked it. Mark stood on the porch and held my hand and said, "Yeah, I can see us here," and this time it was just the two of us seeing it. My son was born on a Tuesday in October, 8 pounds, furious about the whole thing, with a cry that filled the entire floor of the hospital. And when the nurse asked me his name for the records for the little band they put around his tiny wrist, I said it clearly, with my husband standing right beside me holding my hand, and my father in the hallway, and my mother somewhere I can't prove but absolutely believe. I said, "His name is Henry. Henry Daniel, actually. Daniel for my father, who stood up at that table when no one else would. Not Charles anywhere in it." And Diane held him eventually, because I am not a cruel woman and he is her grandson and a child cannot have too many people who love him. She held him and she looked at me over his little head. And she didn't apologize, she'll never apologize, but she said, "He's a good strong boy." And I said, "He is." And that was as close to peace as she and I will ever get, and it turned out to be enough. He's 2 now. He is gentle, exactly like my mother said he'd be. He sits very still when he's scared and he likes it when you explain things to him in a calm voice. The other night there was a thunderstorm and he climbed into my lap, and I told him the same thing my grandfather told my mother, that the thunder is just God moving furniture. And he laughed. My mother's laugh on my grandfather's name in a house I chose, and I held him and I thought, there you are. There's the life I almost gave away, one polite surrender at a time. I think about that woman sometimes. The one who looked at her husband before answering simple questions. The one who cried at a red light in a car she didn't choose. I'm not angry at her anymore. She was just tired and lonely and trying so hard to keep a peace that was never real. But I'm not her now. I became someone else in the half second it takes to say one small word at a crowded table. So that's my story. That's how I let another woman choose my house, my car, and almost the name of my son, and how one word at a dinner table gave me my life back. If you made it all the way here with me, thank you truly. Do me one favor before you go. Subscribe so the next story finds you. And then tell me down in the comments, I really want to know. What would you have done sitting at that table when the glasses started to rise? Would you have said the word? Or would you have lifted your glass and stayed quiet one more time? Tell me. I read them all.